So a lot of people liked my video on the original Dead Rising Psychopaths. A lot of people had their own thoughts on the video, and some wanted to know my thoughts about Dead Rising 2. In particular, the Psychopaths or boss battles in that game. First, before we begin the video, I'll give a brief overview of the Psychopaths as a game mechanic. However, if you're watching this and I assume you have a basic understanding of the franchise, or have seen my first video. For the 3 people watching this who have no idea what the game is, Dead Rising 2 is a survival horror game released in 2010 and serves as a sequel to the 2006 video game Dead Rising. The game takes place in the fictional Fortune City as the protagonist Chuck Green attempts to uncover the conspiracy behind the outbreak. He also has to clear his name as he's been framed for the incident. Gameplay wise, Dead Rising 2 is similar to its predecessor, but with slight improvements, new mechanics, and even a new multiplayer and co-op mode. The player will still follow a time narrative and will be faced with optional side missions, like rescuing survivors, playing mini games, and of course fighting psychopaths, the boss battles of the game. In the first video, I talked about how the psychopaths affected the gameplay and the narrative, and how it added so much to the game. And I'll be comparing the 2 games as you run through this video. There are also other gameplay mechanics I'll have to analyze on top of the boss fight. Also, there will be some spoilers for the first 2 Dead Rising games, so without further ado, let's get to the video. Now let's go over how the psychopath mechanic works in the Dead Rising franchise, especially in this game. Throughout the game, Chuck will receive messages for optional side missions. These missions have a finite amount of time before they expire, but essentially if you enter the arena for a psychopath and defeat them, you can earn some extra PP to level up, or maybe even a weapon, survivor, or another useful item to use. Just like in the first game, these bosses range from people who've had their psyche broken from the outbreak, people taking advantage of the situation, and a new subcategory, those who know Chuck or know of him. But who are these psychopaths? Well, let's run through them. Brent, or Slappy, a children-themed mascot who blames Chuck for the death of his friend. Ted, a tiger trainer who trains Snowflake. Snowflake, a tiger. Leon Bell, a motocross enthusiast who wants to one-up Chuck. Brandon, a crazed activist who wants to turn everyone to zombies. Antoine, a psychotic celebrity chef. Randy, a chainsaw-wielding sexual deviant. Carl, a mailman who blames Chuck for the outbreak. Seymour, a Western-obsessed security guard. The Hunters, a group of 4 militiamen who shoot everyone. BB Love, a pop singer who is performing in the city. Roger and Reed, 2 mediocre musicians who perform in one of the casinos. And the Looters. While not main bosses, you encounter these guys around the map as either enemies or shopkeepers. The story psychopaths are Tyrone King, the host of the infamous game show Terror is Reality, the Bailey Twins, otherwise known as the Twins, they're TK's henchmen, or henchwomen, Sullivan, the undercover Phoenotrans agent who framed Chuck for the outbreak, Sergeant Boykin, a soldier who gets cell shocks from the zombies, and Mark and Pierce, 2 scientists working for Phoenotrans, the villain corporation of the game. Just like in my first video, we'll discuss what's cool about them, how they impact the gameplay and story, and address any negative feedback I have about them. Beginning with the first point of my analysis, you might recognize some similarities with the first game in terms of the roster. A crazed sexual deviant who is taking advantage of the outbreak, a children's entertainer who gets his psyche broken, a pompous and cocky opponent who happens to have the same occupation as our protagonist, and a few more. But like any sequel, they do throw some new ideas into the mix. One of these ideas being that one of the psychos is an actual tiger. Come on, I don't care who you are, that's pretty awesome. Another cool idea being that some of these guys actually know Chuck, either because he was a minor celebrity or they blame him for the outbreak, which ties back into the main story. Whereas in the first game, Frank was just some random dude tossed into these situations. The third way is changing up how you fight them. I'll go into the gameplay aspect in much detail later, but the fight against BB is just a fetch quest and a quicktime event. And while Dead Rising 2 does throw these new gameplay features and ideas into the mix, it still does try to recreate the charm of the first game. So that being said, let's get to the story and I guess by extent, the psychopaths you encounter when completing that story. So I already mentioned the basics of the story, but how does Dead Rising 2 expand upon the original's narrative? Well, outside of the game, there's a lot of marketing and advertising. For example, many of the fictional organizations within the game had websites. And obviously these organizations appear in the game and heavily influence the narrative. However, for purposes of the video, only 2 are relevant, as some of the psychopaths are affiliated with these organizations. In the game, it's been several years after the first Dead Rising, and the public now knows that zombies exist, especially since other cities have fallen due to outbreaks. The organization known as Cure advocates against zombies being used for experimentation or entertainment purposes. Of course they butt heads with Terror is Reality, a game show that uses zombies as fodder as opponents compete to slaughter them in the wackiest way possible. The game show is also an excuse for the game to have a multiplayer mode because every sequel in the early 2010s needed one. Side note, I love this mode, but good luck trying to find anyone today to play it. At the beginning of the game, Chuck is competing in this show in order to use the prize money to buy Zombrex, a drug that nullifies the zombie parasite, because his daughter Katie is infected. From the get-go, it's cool that Dead Rising 2 is expanding upon the universe of the franchise instead of just copying the first game. Heck, if it wasn't for some references to the first game and the 2 in the title, you'd think this would be a soft reboot. Like the first game, the main story psychopaths are tailored to the plot of the game. As already mentioned, the main story bosses are TK, the twins, Sullivan, Dwight, and Mark and Pierce. TK is the host of the game show and is in the plot to frame Chuck. He ends up trying to rob the city later with some mercenaries, and Chuck stops him. If he's given Zombrex later in the game, he'll become the final boss in overtime mode. The twins show up a few times in the game for their fight and are TK's henchwomen. Honestly, you could cut them from the game and miss really nothing. Later in the game, Sergeant Boykin goes crazy and kidnaps Rebecca. Sullivan, Mark, and Pierce work for Phoenotrans, the villain corporation in the game. They unleash the Terror is Reality zombie stock so they could gather more queens for Zombrex. Sullivan is a twist villain in the game, as he goes undercover throughout the entire plot and is the one who actually planned the bomb to release the zombies. So to summarize, most of the main story psychopaths do a decent job of engaging your interest in the story. Like the first game, yeah, get used to me saying that, there is a mystery that the player needs to solve. Who framed Chuck? Why'd they do it? What's their goal? Each of these fights partially answers these questions. Now the story of Dead Rising 2 plays out kinda like an action movie, and I'll mention that a few times. In fact, I feel like I've seen this trend of a badass action hero having to clear his name in other media, but that isn't a complaint. I will say, from a narrative standpoint, Dead Rising 2's antagonists aren't really that deep or thought-engaging like the first game's antagonist. There's no ethical dilemma or a character with deep motivations like Carlito, but that's okay. Not every game needs to be some major thesis for some philosophy course. But the story bosses in Dead Rising 2 do a great job of making the story engaging. Now that we've covered how the main story psychopaths affect the story, let's get to the other psychopaths. Okay, I'll admit the complaints in this portion might seem minute, but there are a few. So in the first Dead Rising, I praised how the psychopaths affected the world building of the game, how some survivors mentioned them before you encountered them, how they affected the environment, and how they impacted the main character. Well, in Dead Rising 2 you kind of have that. Some of the psychopaths are advertised throughout the map, like Snowflake, Antoine, Slappy, and BB. Some still do affect the environment. For example, Brandon's bathroom arena will still remain dilapidated after you defeat him, and the mailman's golf cart remains will stay in the plaza as well. Seymour will hang his victims, and Slappy's dead girlfriend can be seen. Also in overtime mode, TK will taunt Chuck on the arena's intercom.
Katie's so cute. It's a shame she won't ever see her daddy again.
These are some pretty solid examples, so Dead Rising 2 seems to have taken a page from the first game's book in this regard. For their impact on our main character, they don't really seem to have an impact on Chuck. In the first game, Frank would show some disgust or some emotion after their demise, again having some realism. I even theorized that some of these affected Frank's character, as he starts the game off as a hot-headed journalist and ends the game with wanting to uncover the truth behind the outbreak. I won't go into too much detail about this because my first video covers it, but in Dead Rising 2, Chuck, again like an action movie, would spout these one-liners after the fight.
Gonna Win big? I saw what you did there. Yeah, you're on fire. You may now kiss the bride.
It should be said that Chuck has no development throughout the game. I still like him as a protagonist, but he's the exact same at the beginning of the game as he is at the end of it. And I think this is more a criticism of Chuck than it is of Psychopaths. But there's no memorable, heartbreaking death like Cliff's, or one that shows some character development like Kent's death that gets a defining character moment from the protagonist. Heck, in fact, most of it's played for laughs or for shock value. Then again, some in the first game were too. The only one that I feel pity for is Ted, Snowflake's handler. He's just some guy who wants to feed Snowflake and attacks Chuck over some misunderstanding. But his death isn't nearly on the same emotional level as Cliff from the first game. I feel like I do have to address the elephant in the room, as I think most of these criticisms come from two valid reasons. One being that the game is made by a separate studio, Capcom Vancouver, while the first game is made in-house by Capcom. Second, because of this is kinda when Dead Rising was teetering on some levels of goofiness, which we'll cover later. But compare these scenes from the first game with the second.
If we are to achieve salvation,
Didn't get enough of me yet? Come back for my autograph?
oh, I bet you just get rock hard thinking about me at night, don't you, Chucky?
By the time I'm done beating information out of you, you are gonna be begging for death to come take you away.
Only way to get this country on track again is clean it right up of all those pansies, floozies, bureaucrats, liberals, and them half-ass conservatives too. This is a golden opportunity.
There's definitely more of a horror vibe in the first game. I can kinda see why they did this, as I don't think the horror vibe from the first game would really fit in well to this colorful, flamboyant scenery of Fortune City. So I do think they had to deviate a bit from the first game to make it work. I still enjoy them and like them as they have unique motivations, personalities, and some cool fights. I know they couldn't mimic the first game, and they didn't, and they knew they couldn't. I'm not complaining, I think this vibe fits the sequel pretty well. At the end of the day, it just depends on which one you like. The more gritty, horror-like aspect, or the more exaggerated, zany aspect. And in my opinion, I go back and forth, but the first game again takes it for me. I'll start my list of praises by going back to the story aspect a bit. I really do love how some of the psychopaths know Chuck. Leon, Brandon, Carl, and Slappy. Leon competed against Chuck in Terror's Reality, and Brandon is a crazed cure activist who looks up to Chuck. Again, Dead Rising 2 does try new ideas, and they do work. Instead of just walking up on some crazy dude like in the first game who didn't know Frank, these guys know Chuck and actually want to kill him. Speaking of Brandon and Leon, it is a cool idea to have psychopaths associated with the new organizations set in the Dead Rising universe. Leon from Terror's Reality and Brandon from Cure. Leon, like I said, is essentially this game's version of Kent. He was also a motocross enthusiast who looked up to Chuck and shows up twice in the game, once in the prologue and another in his fight. I will say he is pretty quick to turn evil, like really fast. Also, you do have Dwight Boykin, as I already mentioned, who is a sergeant in the anti-zombie unit of the National Guard. Yeah, now the US military has protocols to deal with outbreaks, so there is some expansion to the lore within the Dead Rising universe. Like I said, there's a lot of cool stuff here, and a lot of it does work. But again, we're not only looking at the story, but also at the gameplay. Through its psychopath battles though, Dead Rising 2 does implement new ideas in its gameplay as well. So without further ado, let's get to how Dead Rising 2 shakes it up gameplay wise. So in my first video, I spent a majority of the time discussing the story implications of the Psychopaths, and didn't really focus on the gameplay side. In the first game, I mentioned one of my main complaints about the bosses was how easy they could be taken out if you had the appropriate weapons. Really, some of them could really be taken out in seconds with little difficulty. If you were a semi-competent Dead Rising player equipped with Adam's small chainsaw, then you've won the game. Congratulations. Well, in Dead Rising 2, I'm going to talk more about the gameplay aspect as there are massive changes for the better. The basics are still there. Every psychopath has different tactics and attacks, but in this game, there is a noticeable difficulty spike. There's no one-shot kill weapon like the Mega Man Buster, Adam's chainsaw, or the laser sword. Instead, you actually have to plan on how to approach these guys and do some inventory planning. Do you want to bring some firearms? How about healing items? Maybe even a survivor equipped with a weapon to help out? What about a book? There's so many ways to approach these fights. Unlike the first game, you can move and shoot, so psychopath battles can be more fast-paced. Also, there is a caveat to inventory management. Don't drink a lot of alcoholic healing items in the fight. You would drop your weapon and be open for an attack. This was a minute detail in the first game, as only a handful of foods made Frank sick. But in the second game, when most of the high-value healing items are alcohol, it can be life or death in a fight. But on that note, I do want to backtrack. Although there are no OP weapons in the game, the remastered ports of Dead Rising 2 included all of the skills packs cosmetics for free. In the original version, these were paid DLC released after the game's launch. Just wear one piece from any pack, and you can unlock unique abilities, additional attacks, extra ammo, and more. One of them, for example, allows Chuck to never be sick from drinking too much, which completely negates the mechanic I just mentioned seconds ago. So essentially, if you wear one piece from each set, you can become the Superman of Fortune City. I only use them whenever I showcase these abilities for a video or to make capturing footage for longer projects easier. For example, for much of this footage, I used the ninja boots from the ninja pack, which makes it harder for zombies to grab you. Sorry for that mini diatribe, but I knew someone would say something if I didn't mention these. But to conclude my rant, in my opinion, they should have been unlocked in New Game Plus, because some obviously make the bosses way too easy, as they can give an unfair advantage in combat. Speaking of combat, the biggest change from the first game is the introduction of combo weapons. Since Chuck isn't a photographer like Frank, who instead have to use his handyman skills to earn PP to level up. By using the maintenance rooms around the map, you can create a variety of combo weapons from different items. Some are, to be honest, kinda useless, some are great for farming XP on zombies, and others are crucial for defeating psychopaths. There's so many of them, and you can experiment with what combinations you think are most helpful in the fight. For me, as you can tell by the footage, I always bring some knife gloves, a laser sword, or a spike bat, along with some firearms. Maybe you bring some different combo weapons. Maybe you're one of those weird people who use regular weapons from the mall. Yeah, I will say one secondary downside to this combo weapon mechanic is this started the whole progression of the franchise, going from use whatever you can find in the shopping mall to survive, to see what wacky contraption you can use to kill zombies. But to be fair, this does fit in with the narrative of the game, since there is an entire in-universe organization devoted to making these weapons. Also, some of the bosses will use these weapons when you fight them, like Leon, Roger, and Slappy. But my gripes with the combo system are more aimed towards what the franchise would become, not the bosses in this game. I would say that the combo weapon system actually complements the Psychopaths, and vice versa. Now, even with all these weapons at your disposal, the fights can still be difficult, and I'm all here for it. I've been playing this game for over 14 years, and Chef Antoine and Brandon, even with help from a co-op partner, can still kill me with ease. In the first game, you could tank most of the hits because you knew you would always kill the boss before they killed you. Here, if you do that, you're gonna get your ass kicked. Also, these fights are a bit more hectic and crazier in both tone and gameplay. For example, a Cell Driller song will accompany these fights. I mentioned in the last video how Dead Rising 1 had some good tunes from a variety of bands, but here is just one or two composers and it feels like the same crazy or techno theme for every boss. Some of them work. I personally like Seymour's theme, Snowflake's, Randy's, and Antoine's, but some just feel interchangeable. Just a nitpick, but you associate some of these bosses with their awesome music, like Adam, Joe, or the Convicts. The Hunters in this game have a unique theme that isn't Cell Dweller, and is actually my favorite just from the first few ominous notes. Slappy's theme actually has these voice lines that I assume are from his dead girlfriend, which I guess is supposed to represent his broken mind, but it's the only Psycho theme that has something like this. Another way the battles are more chaotic is that zombies are often occupied the arena. In the first game, that was only the focus of a few fights, but here, in almost every fight, you'll still have to be cautious because of the zombies. It adds to the challenge, because if you try and sneak away to heal, you might get interrupted or grabbed by a zombie. Some of the paired psychopaths will even tag team you while you try to retreat, like Roger and Reed or the twins, and honestly it can make the fights pretty tense. As I already mentioned, the psychopaths have different strategies and these affect how you fight them. Antoine will run around his restaurant and heal while hitting you with his frying pan, throwing dishes, or even choking you. Brandon is fast and will deal heavy damage, but also ambush you using the bathroom stalls. The Hunters camp out in the outdoor plazas and will snipe you from a distance. Slappy is probably the fastest psychopath and has a variety of flamethrower attacks. Fun fact, you can actually kick him or shoot him with a water gun to stun him. Seymour can disarm you and will also lasso you. Randy will charge you with his chainsaw, and you can also shoot the pig on his crotch to stun him. Let's talk about two semi-unique psychopaths in more detail, Snowflake and BB. You can actually say both of them as survivors, but the ways you do it are actually unique. Essentially, when Snowflake charges at you, you have to throw 3 steaks for her to eat. Later in the safe room, you can actually give Snowflake to Katie as a gift. Also, BB has already stated doesn't really have a fight per se, it's just a fetch quest with a QuickTime event. So it's cool, not every fight is bashing the Psycho's head in with a spiked bat, instead it has some variety. I guess I'll also mention the looters, since I don't really have a place to put them in the script. As I previously alluded to, these guys are the regular enemies you encounter throughout most of the game. They're essentially replaced the cult from the first game, but they appear much sooner in the game and disappear once the military shows up, so you'll see them much more. Obviously these guys aren't creepy like the True cult, but they're a more realistic enemy and I think it fits the game pretty well. It is pretty plausible for a group of looters to appear during an outbreak. They do have a cool motive, as it's inferred that they steal so they can sell merchandise in the multiple shops across the map. This is pretty cool, but to be honest, I don't really use these shops too often, unless I buy a one-time purchase of the vehicle keys, or a rare purchase of Zombrex, but again, it's pretty cool. So from a gameplay side, all of these psychopaths bring something to the table while addressing my minor complaints about the bosses from the first game. And really that's what a good sequel should do, build off of the first game while not relying too much on it or deviating too far from it. I will say most of the psychopaths in this game are pretty memorable and they're pretty solid. At the end of the day, there are some sequels where I like some aspects from the first game better than the second, and vice versa. And I think the first 2 Dead Rising games fall into that category. Dead Rising 2 is the first Dead Rising game I ever played, so it actually does have that nostalgic charm to me. I even remember renting this from my local video store when those were still a thing, all the way back in 2010. Obviously the first 2 Dead Rising games are fan favorites to many, but do the bosses in Dead Rising 2 hold a candle to those from the first game? Well, let me know what you guys think in the comments about that. But to conclude the video, I just want to state that this project took a long time to make. Editing, capturing footage, and of course the script, which is probably the biggest pain in this video. There's a lot of last minute additions and revisions to the script, so sorry if this video seems scatterbrained compared to my other videos. Also, there's some technical issues with my mic, which I hope aren't reflected in this video. Either way, I'm excited for the new remaster coming out of Dead Rising 1, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. See you next time.